And good morning, everyone. Happy Friday morning to you, and welcome back to Morning Musings. My name is Don K. Preston. I'm the president of Preterist Research Institute of Ardmore, Oklahoma, and this is video number 24 in our examination and refutation of the book by my friend Steve Gregg entitled, Why Not Full Preterism? A Partial Preterist Response to a Novel Theological Innovation. Now, last week, I examined Steve's appeal to Job chapter 19 as a prediction of the end of time resurrection. Now, let me remind you, okay, this is really, really important. In our debate in Denver, sponsored by my friend Mike Zeman, who did a fantastic job of organizing everything, Steve argued that the Old Testament did not predict the resurrection. In his book, on page 346, Steve also argues that the resurrection and the church were not predicted in the Old Testament. They were mysteries that were not foretold in the Old Testament. Only the New Testament foretold them. But then, amazingly enough, on pages 127 and following, once again, he says Job 19 predicted the end of time resurrection. Then, on page 128, 129, he appeals to Acts chapter 2 in its citation of Psalm 16. You will not leave my soul in Hades, neither will you allow your Holy One to see corruption. That's supposedly a prediction of David's physical resurrection at the end of time, although it referred, of course, to Jesus. Then he appeals to Isaiah chapter 25, verse 8, Hosea 13, 14, Isaiah 26, 19, and Hosea 13. Now, amazingly, he says on top of page 129, it may reasonably be suggested that the third and fourth of the above four examples, which are Isaiah 25, Hosea 13, Isaiah 26, and Hosea 6, 1 and 2. So he says number 3 and 4, which would be Isaiah 26 and Hosea chapter 6. It may reasonably be suggested that the third and fourth of the above four examples can conceivably be taken non-literally as metaphors, similar to Ezekiel's dry bones in Ezekiel chapter 37. Well, I suppose he kind of sees a problem there, so he continues. The problem this creates is that they appear in close proximity to the first two examples, Isaiah 25, 8, Hosea 13, 14, both of which Paul applies to the final resurrection, and they sound as if they are on the same subject. Even if we are not sure that all four passages speak of the same thing, we cannot reasonably deny that Paul saw references to his own and the rabbi's doctrine of the resurrection in Isaiah and in Hosea. And then he says, the last Old Testament text to consider is near the end of Daniel's fourth vision, Daniel chapter 12, verse 2. Many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth shall arise, some to everlasting shame, some to everlasting life. And he says, this is generally recognized as a prophecy of the eschatological resurrection. Keep that in mind. In chapter 9, I will suggest an alternative possibility concerning the meaning of this particular verse. Now, what Steve will suggest in chapter 9 is that Daniel chapter 12, verse 2, just like Ezekiel 37, just like Isaiah 26, just like Hosea 13, 6, refer to AD 70. They do not refer to individual bodies coming out of the grave. They refer to AD 70, the spiritual resurrection, transformation from the old covenant to the new. So what Steve has done here, he has given us 5, perhaps 6 verses, Ezekiel 37 and the ones that I just read from. And he admits, well, hey, all of these verses could be applied metaphorically, except Paul applies 2 of them literally. No, he doesn't. Not at all. And by the way, Steve never goes into any detail. Now notice, he applies Isaiah chapter 26. Let me read that. Your dead shall live. Together with my dead body they shall rise. Awake and sing, you who dwell in the dust, for your dew is like the dew of herbs. The earth shall cast out the dead. Steve doesn't give us an exegesis of this text, but he does admit it could probably be applied metaphorically. So here are dead bodies coming out of the dust. AD 70 per Steve. Daniel chapter 12, verse 2. The dead coming out of the dust. AD 70 per Steve. Why isn't that the resurrection of 1 Corinthians 15, which cites Isaiah 25, verse 8, which is the same resurrection as Isaiah 26? You see, Steve has to argue. Okay, Isaiah 25, verse 8, Paul quoted that as a prediction of the resurrection. Now remember, Steve's already told us the Old Testament doesn't predict the resurrection. Then how can he say that Isaiah 25, verse 8 and Hosea 13 predicted the resurrection? I hate to keep emphasizing this, but this is a massive contradiction. So Isaiah 25, verse 8, what does Steve do with this? After telling us the Old Testament did not predict the resurrection, he quotes from Isaiah chapter 25, verse 8, and says, it did predict the resurrection, but how does he get over that conundrum? He tells us, I've already documented this, he tells us that Isaiah 25, verse 8 is an independent, standalone, parenthetic prophecy of the resurrection that is inserted into the discussion of the prediction of AD 70 in verses 1 through 7 and verses 9 and following. So remember, according to Steve, Isaiah 25, 1 to 7, AD 70. Isaiah 25, 9 and following, AD 70. But without any warning whatsoever, without any grammatical, linguistic, textual indication, all of a sudden Yahweh inserted verse 8 into the text, totally unrelated to the context, and said, by the way. Now listen, folks, a parenthetic statement is inserted to clarify, to emphasize what is already being discussed. A parenthetic discussion or parenthetic statement is not something that is radically disassociated or disjunctive to what's under consideration. That would be like saying, boy, I really, really enjoy old Mustangs and old cars, and I've got this and I've got that, and I'm working on this and that, and Loch Ness Monster doesn't exist, and I've got a 69 Mach 1. Say what? Folks, that's not a true parenthetic statement. That's an aberration. That makes no sense whatsoever. But that basically is what Steve is telling us on Isaiah chapter 25. Now watch this. He says that Paul quotes Hosea chapter 13, 14 to apply to the resurrection of biological bodies coming out of the graves. Well, wait a minute. 1 Corinthians chapter 15, 55 and 56 is the anticipation of the fulfillment of Hosea chapter 13 and the prophecy of the resurrection. The prophecy of the resurrection in Hosea chapter 13, 14 is the prophecy of the deliverance from the death that is found in Hosea 13. I mean, doesn't that make perfect sense? I mean, if Hosea 13 is predicting the resurrection, is it not predicting the resurrection out of the death that is in the context? Okay, what death is in the context? When Israel humbled himself, he was exalted. But when Israel sinned, he died. What? Folks, this is talking about corporate Israel. This is Jacob as a term being used for the whole house of Israel. Actually, in the context of Hosea, it's the 10 northern tribes. When Jacob sinned, he died. When Israel violated the law, he died. How did he die? Oh, Isaiah 27, by being sent off into captivity, by being removed from the land, the city, and the temple. That's how he died. He died covenantally. He was separated and alienated from God. So the resurrection of 1 Corinthians 15 would be in fulfillment of Hosea 13, deliverance from the death mentioned and discussed by Hosea. But the death discussed in Hosea is not biological death. It is covenantal death. It is sin death. It is alienation and separation from God. Therefore, the resurrection of 1 Corinthians 15, which anticipated the resurrection of Hosea 13, was not a prediction of the raising of individual bodies out of the grave. It was the resurrection of Israel out of sin death, covenantal death. Steve has obviously not looked at the context of Hosea. By the way, unless I missed it, possibly could have, obviously. Unless I missed it, Steve doesn't mention Hosea 13 again. He certainly does not do any kind of in-depth exegesis of it. Again, unless I missed it, I don't think I did. But to me, this is very telling. I mean, after all, Hosea 13 serves as one of Paul's key prophecies of the resurrection. Oh, by the way, most scholars agree that in 1 Corinthians 15, Paul is drawing on Ezekiel 37. Wait a minute. Steve Gregg says Ezekiel 37 is not biological resurrection. Likewise, most scholars agree that Paul is drawing on Daniel chapter 12. Daniel 12:2, resurrection to eternal life. 1 Corinthians 15, resurrection to eternal life. But according to Steve Gregg, Daniel chapter 12, verse 2, predicted AD 70. So the two passages that Paul appeals to, and I'll be talking about this more later on, the two passages that Paul discusses or draws on for his doctrine of the resurrection that he echoes, Ezekiel 37, not biological, metaphoric. Daniel chapter 12, verse 2, not literal, metaphoric, AD 70. Hosea 13 cannot be individual bodies, dead bodies. It's metaphoric of sin death. And guess what? Isaiah 25, unless Steve can prove categorically, definitively, without any doubt whatsoever, that it really is some kind of a parenthetical insertion of a prophecy violating the context, then per Steve's own admission that verses 1 through 7 is AD 70, verses 9 and following is AD 70, then guess what that means? Isaiah 25 is also a prediction of a metaphoric, spiritual resurrection in AD 70. Thus, every single verse to which Steve appeals for his doctrine of the resurrection, well, maybe with the exception of Acts 2 or Exodus 3, we can discuss those later. But every one of the other passages that he adduces for his doctrine of the end-of-time resurrection do not teach it by his own admission. Okay, let's continue here. On page 130, Steve makes a very, very remarkable comment. And he says, the postmortem survival of the soul is not the same idea as the resurrection of the dead. The idea of eternal destinies in a disembodied state was a pagan notion, not a scriptural or Jewish one. Well, I'm constantly amazed, and look, we all do this, okay? I'm not singling out Steve by any stretch of the imagination. I understand what he's saying. But when we say, well, the Jews believed, that's really a difficult thing. It doesn't matter if I say it or if Steve says it, really doesn't matter. Can we at times say that certain things were dominant in the Jewish ideology and theology? Yes, we can. They believed in one God. They believed the coming of the Messiah. They believed in the kingdom. They believed in this and that and the other as consensus beliefs. However, there are many things in Jewish belief that it is simply wrong to say, oh, well, the Jews believe this. And in Steve's case, for Steve to say, well, the Jews believed, as if he is claiming that all of the Jews believed this, that this was the majority view. All of the Jews believed in a resurrection of individual bodies at the end of time. Folks, I'm sorry, that is completely historically inaccurate. Is that one of several views among the Jews of the first century? Yes, no question about that. But as one scholar by the name of Karagunas documents, there were no less than 6 different views of the resurrection held by wide-ranging numbers of Jews. It is therefore historically inaccurate. It is inappropriate to say, oh, the Jews believed in physical resurrection. And by the way, when he says the Jews did not believe in eternal destinies in a disembodied state, that was a pagan notion. Once again, that's inaccurate. One of the 6 views among the Jews was souls would be taken out of Hades, taken to heaven, and that was their resurrection. By the way, a very, very early Christian writer, Ignatius, stated that same view, writing in approximately 112 AD. He called that resurrection, coming out of Hades, being taken to heaven. Well, therefore, I guess, according to Steve, Ignatius must have been a heretic. No, he was stating one of the well-documented and well-accepted views of resurrection. But then, Steve, on page 130, has a heading entitled, What the Jews Believed About Resurrection. And he says, Full preterist Max King wrote that the doctrine of resurrection preached by Paul was, quote, radically different from the traditional Jewish understanding of the resurrection, unquote. And he is citing from the cross and the parousia of Christ. However, Paul himself said that the doctrine of resurrection for which he was being persecuted was essentially the same, parentheses, not parentheses, italics, as the doctrine approved by the Jews, particularly the Pharisees, with whom he specifically identified himself on this point. And he quotes for us Acts chapter 23 and verse 6. When the Pharisees believed, when Paul perceived that one part were Sadducees, the other Pharisees, he cried out to the council, Men and brethren, I am a Pharisee, the son of a Pharisee, concerning the hope and resurrection of the dead. I am being judged. Then he goes to Acts chapter 24, verse 15. I have hope in God, which they, the Jews, themselves also accept that there will be a resurrection of the dead, both of the just and the unjust. Now, boy, there's a lot I could say on this. But let me make this observation on Acts chapter 24 and verse 15. Paul says there's to be a resurrection. Well, the Greek is there is about to be. About to be. From melo, in the infinitive, the Blas de Brunner Greek grammar says, item number 56, meline, in the infinitive indicates imminence. I'm not going to go into great detail documenting how the resurrection was imminent in the first century, but here is a text that proves it. Secondly, when Paul says there's going to be the resurrection of the just and the unjust, folks, do you realize that the only passage in the Old Testament, now remember Steve's vacillation here. On the one hand, he says the Old Testament did not predict resurrection. On the other hand, it did. Well, guess what? The only Old Testament passage that specifically speaks of the resurrection of the just and the unjust is Daniel chapter 12, verse 2. Resurrection of some to life, that's the righteous. Resurrection of some, the unrighteous, to eternal condemnation. So here's a passage that virtually all scholars agree. Are there some who differ? Yes. But virtually all scholars agree that Paul's drawing on Daniel chapter 12, verse 2. Well, if Paul in Acts chapter 24 is drawing on Daniel chapter 12, verse 2, then since Gregg applies Daniel chapter 12, verse 2 to AD 70, that kind of strips him of any appeal to Acts 24, verse 15, to an end of time coming. Unless we revert to Steve's position that, well, Paul might have been wrong in his eschatological predictions about the timing. And by the way, has it ever struck you that since Steve says it's possible that the apostles were wrong about the timing of the resurrection, has it ever caused you to ponder, well, okay, then is it possible that they misunderstood the nature of the resurrection? How can you argue, it's entirely possible that the apostles were wrong about the timing of the resurrection, and yet argue, well, they couldn't have been wrong about the nature of it? Where's the logic in that? Okay. So, according to Steve, Paul said, I'm a Pharisee. Steve says, Pharisees believed in physical resurrection. Therefore, Paul believed in physical resurrection. Now, look, I understand that sounds really good. Yeah, I understand that. The trouble of it is, it won't stand up for 2 minutes to a close examination. Now, let's examine what the Pharisees believed about resurrection. Now, here we are focusing on the Pharisaic view of the resurrection. Point number one, did they believe in physical resurrection? Yes, I happily concede that. There are some folks out there who deny that, but I don't. But here is something that Steve completely, totally overlooks. I did for years and years. There's nothing dishonest about this. There's nothing subversive about this. Steve completely overlooks the fact that the Pharisaic concept of the physical resurrection was, and in my book, Paul on Trial, Paul, the Pharisees, and the Resurrection. I document this from a variety and a wide range of scholarly sources. This is not speculation, ladies and gentlemen. This is fact. This is history. Okay? And it's available on my website, donkpreston.com, BibleProphecy.com. I wish I could offer free shipping, but you know what? Guess what? Shipping is going up I think it's next month. I think it's in June. I've already been informed that my printing cost all printing cost by my publisher is going up. And what that means is if you want to order some books at the lower prices, you better get after it because shipping costs are going up and publishing costs are going up in June. So now's the time to take advantage of the lower prices. So anyway, go to my website, donkpreston.com, BibleProphecy.com, and order this book. You'll be glad you did. Here's what I document in the book. Point number one, as I've already noted, the Pharisees definitely believed in resurrection, physical resurrection out of the graves. Point number two, again, a point that I completely missed for years and years and years. I was just simply ignorant of it. The Pharisees linked that resurrection out of biological graves or biological bodies to the return of Israel to the physical land. You know what some of the Pharisees taught in this regard? And this is fully documented. The Pharisees believed if there was a Jew in a far-flung country and he died in that country, in the day of the resurrection, in the day of the Lord, that individual's body would roll in subterranean tunnels, would roll all the way from wherever they were buried, i.e., Rome, Syria, Damascus, didn't matter. Their dead, decomposed body would roll in these subterranean channels, tubes, all the way back to the land of Israel, then be raised out of the dust. Which means they weren't going to be raised out of their own grave, right? That's a problem. So, that point number two, the Pharisees believed that the resurrection of the dead was inextricably, inseparably bound up with the return of Israel to the land. Because after all, the land is the center of the kingdom. It's the center of salvation. Now, they don't seem to expound on the fact that the salvation established in Zion, Isaiah 46:13, would flow to all the world. So why does your physical body have to be raised out of the dirt to receive the salvation that would spread from Zion to all the nations? Yeah, it's a little bit of a problem. And you know what? I'm completely out of time today. So I'm going to call it quits here. In next week's program, I'm going to continue. I'm going to share with you the Pharisaic concept of the resurrection of the dead and everything that they linked to it. And I'll close on this. Time and time again on Facebook and even YouTube, I have been confronted by people who argue Pharisees believed in physical resurrection. Paul said he was a Pharisee, therefore Paul believed in physical resurrection. I have pointed out all of the constituent elements that the Pharisees linked with the physical resurrection. And again, there's no dispute about this historically. It cannot even be challenged. If the Pharisees believed in physical resurrection, which they did, they also believed in all of these things that would happen concurrently with it, synchronously with it. You cannot separate the Pharisaic concept of the resurrection from the Pharisaic view of the things linked with the resurrection. Now, if you want a full documentation of it, it's all in my book. In the meantime, you have a fantastic weekend. I'll see you on Monday.